Okay, so looking at chapter 7, which is a very short chapter of the book, but very important, as the book is getting into the last 75 pages or so, there's a narrowing of the focus, and Dresden becomes more and more central in the book and becomes more and more interspersed with other things that are happening. So in chapter 7, it's combining a couple things. One is the plane crash, which is significant. That's where Billy's father-in-law dies. Also, his wife ends up dying while he's in the hospital during that time period. Um, but the experience of the plane crash itself, as it says here in the beginning, the first paragraph, he knew it was going to crash, but he didn't want to make a fool of himself by saying so. And this is all based on his time travel and his recognition of um, the events of his life and realization of what happens in his life, and that he's sort of caught in this endless loop, like the earlier rhyme that he mentioned in chapter 1. And um, also in this chapter is the use of this barbershop quartet, which is a group of optometrists. So this is important. If you remember the next chapter, these songs are going to trigger memories in Billy, and that's the function that they serve here as well on the airplane. And so, just like Vonnegut referenced that nursery rhyme in chapter 1, the songs have um, a certain quality of transporting him back to a certain time and place. There's also a connection there of repetition in music or in rhymes, and how um, basically that it's going to travel throughout time, just like Billy is. These songs that are passed down and carried on over the years. But the song references a Polish person, and then that immediately um, triggers this memory of Billy seeing a Polish person hanged in public in Dresden. And then getting towards the plane crash, it says here he knows the plane's going to crash, um, and so then he travels back in time to 1944. So in this chapter, it becomes very the motion, time travel between these different periods. The motion of him going back and forth becomes quicker and quicker, and the periods of how long he stays in one place is shorter and shorter. And it's just, as I said, it's becoming much more condensed. This idea of all these times and places being intermingled is condensed as you get closer to the end of the book. So after that immediate transporting back to Dresden, then he's immediately back to the plane crash in Vermont and his rescue there. Basically, that he doesn't even understand at the time when he's being brought down off the mountain after the plane crash. He looks up and he's confused. He thinks that basically he's not sure if he's in the present or if he's in World War II. And something about the look of the people and their uniforms basically transports him back to this war experience. And as it says here at the end of this paragraph, it's a very important quote about Billy. Um, Looking forward to your projects. This is something you want to think about. That it was all right with him. Everything was pretty much all right with Billy. And this really represents Billy's attitude towards everything in life, which is very what you would call fatalistic, meaning that he's just pretty much just accepting of whatever happens, and he's just carried along by these larger forces that he just submits to, um, that basically operate on him. And this gets back to the earlier point about the limitation of free will and this question of predeterminism, as far as everything's already happened, and so there's no reason to go against that or to fight against that or to try to avoid it. This acceptance of fate. Um, and that's the fatal, that describes the fatalism or the fatalistic quality of Billy. And then very similar to what we talked about last time, some of you wrote about on the discussion board about the Serenity Prayer, accepting the things that you cannot change, um, and basically going with the flow. And that's what Billy's attitude is throughout the book. Right after that, though, He's taken to the hospital. This is in Vermont. Um, at the same time, the next paragraph, um, basically it goes right to the first evening in the slaughterhouse. So you have this intermingling of the two locations, the hospital and the slaughterhouse, the event of the plane crash and his experience during the war. And later, this is going to also be directly tied into um, his experience at the zoo on Tralfamadore. So, you have these various locations I mentioned earlier where Billy's just sort of held captive, these holding cells of a certain extent, and even the slaughterhouse and the way it's described is very much like a zoo. And Vonnegut's making the connection here between the slaughter of animals, which is what the original use of this structure was for, but also the slaughter of humans and the inhumanity ultimately of people, that we place ourselves on this higher plane, but we're basically animals, or as the Tralfamadores see everyone as machines, basically, not even having agency, not even having free will, but just being these individual machines that operate until they break down. And then one more important point here for chapter 7, in the very end, when it's talking about Billy working in the with the syrup that they were making and how they would eat the syrup while they were making it. And there's this brief scene here because Edgar Derby, remember, has already been identified as the character whose death is going to be the climax or the final act of the book, is becoming more important as a character. And so Billy is eating these lollipops or making these lollipops from the syrup in the vat of syrup, and Edgar Derby sees that. He's outside and he comes to the window, and Billy passes him a lollipop, and Edgar Derby's overcome with emotion for this act of kindness. And this is very similar, if you remember, to if you think about the earlier, not just the whole thing about good fortune and bad fortune, and how characters' stories are all intermingled between those series of good and bad fortune, but also Vonnegut's philosophy about the philosophy of life and what the purpose of life is. This idea of helping each other through this thing, whatever it is. And so that's the piece of hope, or that Vonnegut will throw in. So I'm just showing you some of these ideas that were reflected in the earlier video, if you recall. Purpose of human life, no matter who is controlling it, is to love whoever is around to be loved. And this act of kindness that Billy has towards, expresses towards Edgar Derby is an example of that. Also, this idea of the Karass, and that the Karass are people that we connect to and are bound to, and willingly. This idea of people who are cosmically linked through a shared purpose. So Billy and Edgar Derby have this connection. Then you have the psychopaths like Lazaro and others who don't have that connection, or he does not have that connection with, even though they have shared background. They're both in the military. They're both Americans. The Grand Falloon, the idea of the Grand Falloon, which is people who just are more randomly put together. But the idea is that this is what needs to be rejected, this idea of this artificial or superficial connection with other people, as opposed to this really deep connection that we can make with other people. And so this is a perfect example of that at the end of chapter 7, with Billy sharing or giving the lollipop to Edgar Derby. And chapter 8 is rather long. I want to just kind of go through it fairly quickly and just highlight a couple quick points. It begins with this character of Howard Campbell, and I don't want to get too much into him, although he is a recurring character, as Vonnegut often has in his stories, characters who carry over throughout different stories, different novels. And so Howard Campbell is actually the focus of the novel, called Mother Night, and he was an American who was basically a Nazi spy, a Nazi collaborator, a propagandist. And as far as his importance here, he comes to address the troops, or the prisoners, I should say. And The significance here is really focused on Derby. Again, as I said, it becomes more as Dresden and the setting of Dresden and the events there become more focused near the end of the book, and Derby emerges as a more and more important character of the book. He confronts Campbell. And so, basically Campbell's representing Nazism and fascism. And Edgar Derby, who is the high school teacher, um, is going to speak up for the American ideals. But a couple of things Vonnegut says here. One is that there are it's a typo, almost no characters in the story and almost no dramatic confrontations because most of the people in it are so sick and so much the listless playthings of enormous forces. One of the main effects of war, after all, is that people are discouraged from being characters. But old Derby was a character now. So he's the one character who's going to, in this case, really stand up and assert his free will and go beyond or fight beyond the feeling of hopelessness and helplessness that Vonnegut's referring to here. And so, again, thinking about Slaughterhouse-Five as a Tralfamadorian novel, this idea of it's not so much about conflict and characters as a sequence of events that transcend time and space and that basically go up and down with no real clear arc and back and forth, and that whole diagram of how Vonnegut sees stories. And this is the perfect expression of what I was referring to in the last chapter when he said that people are so sick and so much the listless playthings of enormous forces. And that's this idea that Billy has come to accept, this fatalistic idea that, you can't do anything about it. Things are going to turn out the way they're going to turn out. But Derby is going to stand up to that and fight against that. And that he basically confronts Campbell and speaks up for the values of America. And it's kind of the irony here is that that's undercut. His argument is undercut. The Brotherhood is undercut by the air raid sirens that are going to come. And so this idea of brotherhood at the same time, the idea of brotherhood between humanity and especially nations being an illusion or being a false sense of reality because countries are only going to align when it serves their best interest. And so when Vonnegut's writing this, America and Russia are engaged in a Cold War. But at the time that they were fighting Germany, they came together to do that. And so just again, going back to a point he's made earlier about the eternal nature of humanity and power, that it produces endless conflict. So Derby is speaking idealistically, as it says here, ideals. He was basically saying he would die for the ideals of America. But the reality of how that looks in real life, the reality of that is undercutting his argument. Now, it wasn't that air raid signal did not represent the actual bombing of Dresden. That was going to be the next night. But again, Billy immediately is going to transform and then into an argument with his daughter about Kilgore Trout. And here's where you're going to get a lot of information about Kilgore Trout in this chapter. And he's certainly an important character insofar as some of the ideas that he puts out there. And he is another character who recurs throughout many of Vonnegut's stories, and he often serves as a alter ego, another self of Vonnegut. And he's a science fiction writer, so he's able to introduce a lot of these sort of more extreme concepts or ideas that Vonnegut often incorporates into his story. At the same time, by doing that, pointing out the absurdity of our reality. People want to look at science fiction as being something extreme, and certainly Kilgore Trout's concepts can be very extreme. But the idea is that they're meant to be metaphors or represent something true about life, our lives. Along those same lines, a little bit further in chapter 8 is when Kilgore Trout It's talking about fiction and says it's like advertising. You have to tell the truth in advertising or you get in trouble. Um, and, kind of a tongue-in-cheek response here is that, of course, advertising is not true, or at least maybe that stretches the truth or twists the truth. And that's what fiction does as well. So there's deeper truths there. There is truth there, but it's not truth on the surface level. These aren't real people, real events, although they may relate to real people and real events or real experiences of those people. This transforms, or this changes quickly to Billy then thinking back to or experiencing directly this anniversary party. I should say his wife. Remember, his wife died when he was in the hospital after the plane crash, which was described in the previous chapter. And this song of the old gang of mine. And again, going back to music and the importance of that, the repetition of that, and how it carries over throughout time. And he doesn't know why the song is upsetting him so much. At the end of the chapter, as he describes the bombing of Dresden, he will return to this concept, this idea um, of basically how everything has disappeared. So the line, so long forever, old fellows and gals, so long forever, old sweethearts and pals. And that's going to be the reflection of Dresden the morning after the bombing as he walks through what he calls basically a moonscape. But at the time, Billy's not really sure why, but he finds himself so upset by this song, and he's not really sure what it is about this song that's doing it. Other than the fact he never really had those things the song was about. The song's all about people coming together, as I've just mentioned, with loving one another or forming this chorus, this cosmic linking of others. And he feels an absence of that. He doesn't have a real strong connection with anyone in the book, whether it's his family, his wife, his children, others. Um, there's maybe brief glimpses of that, but he doesn't really have that sort of sustained connection. Um, but he's not really sure the music itself is triggering something in him, as if he's being tortured. And everyone reacts. They notice this. He's visibly upset. They think he's maybe even having a heart attack. Um, and as it says here, he thought that he didn't have any secrets from himself, or he thought he really knew himself, but obviously there was something deep inside him, some secret that he wasn't aware of, because just for something like this song to touch him so deeply and so randomly, he's not really able to find some explanation for that. As I said, later the connection becomes more clear where that's coming from. But it's almost like a post-traumatic stress disorder, a blocking out of trauma, um, or the relation that this song has to his traumatic experience from the war in Dresden. And also further linking this event to the previous chapter in the plane crash, um, was the group of singers. So it's the same group of singers in both chapters, different periods of time, obviously, because they died in the plane crash as well in the previous chapter. But now they're alive in this chapter, in this period of his life. But there is a common linkage there between that particular group and the song and how it makes him feel at the party, versus later the singing is going to also be what his memory is of the plane crash. So this other traumatic event that is Billy's experience as well, not just the Dresden bombing, but the plane crash, that is linked to this. Because remember, everyone on the plane died except for him, and his wife ultimately dies after that while he's in the hospital. And just to kind of wrap this up a little bit further, there's later in the chapter, Billy is upset again by a song, and it really has no connection whatsoever. The words, at least, have no connection whatsoever to his experience. But he realizes there's something that he's definitely associating with these four men. And it's not so much what they sang, but the men themselves. And so yeah, that relates, as I just said, to the plane crash. But this is also then setting up for the end of the book. And if you remember the experience of the four men at the end, after the war, I'm sorry, after the bombing of Dresden, the four men who are wandering around, then ultimately that leads to Derby's assassination. Billy then gets into the more specific connection here with the once he started thinking about the effect the quartet had on him, and the association that he had had long ago, or the experience he had had long ago, and he didn't have to travel. He just remembered it in detail, and it was going back to the slaughterhouse in the meat locker on the night that Dresden was destroyed. And again, so it says the Americans and four of their guards and a few dressed carcasses were down there and nobody else. Again, the number four. The rest of the guards had gone to the comforts of their own homes in Dresden. They were all being killed with their families. So this is the actual event. So this is something that he doesn't need to travel back to. It's something that's just imprinted on his memory. So as he's watching the guards, and remember there's four of them, and he's talking about their expressions towards one another. And basically, they said nothing, and they're just sort of in shock. And as he said, they look like a silent film of a barbershop quartet. So here's a direct correlation with the barbershop quartet. And he said they might have as well been singing the lyrics to that song, "So Long Forever, Old Fellows and Pals." And so that is now the basically the complete destruction of their Karras, their group, everything they connected to or were linked to, everyone they were linked to, and that's now being destroyed. And this is the realization of that is overwhelming them, obviously. Right after that, we have a flashback to the zoo. Again, I mentioned that connection with the zoo and the slaughterhouse and the hospital. All those locations sort of become more merged together here near the end of the book. And in chapter 8 specifically, this is chapter 8 is basically the destruction of Dresden, the bombing of Dresden, and the way it's told obviously is interspersed, and the way the rest of the story is. It's not a chronological thing, but not being structured chronologically. But that's one of the main focuses, or the main focus of what's happening here in chapter 8. And as Billy said, it was like the moon. So everything was, he's telling Montana about this in the zoo, everything was basically destroyed. Again, with four, the Americans were formed in ranks of four. So that's how Billy ends up with his group of four, and they had to march back. So a couple quick points for chapter 9. This is when the death of Billy's wife is described. Again, this occurs when he's in the hospital after the plane crash. So this has already happened, would have happened already based on a lot of the events that are described in chapter 7. So a lot of chapter 9 is about Billy's stay in the hospital. Don't want to focus too much on that with the Harvard professor who's writing the book, although there is a relation here where Vonnegut starts to bring in some other events to relate or connect to Dresden, one of which is the bombing of Hiroshima. That's briefly touched on here, as well a statement about this justification for the killing of innocent civilians during the time of war. So whether it's Dresden or whether it's Hiroshima, both represent this concept of total war at the time, which was basically that in order to damage a country, you could attack their population, and that would impact them and militarily and politically. So this is something that's brought up, and the justification here is that it was war, and that basically England was attacked, men, women, children were killed indiscriminately. So therefore, that justifies then what was done in Dresden specifically, or Japanese atrocities, and maybe that justifies what was done in Hiroshima. And then specifically, it references 5 million Allied lives that were lost in the effort to defeat Nazism. So it becomes this idea of accounting and this idea of numbers. And yeah, 135,000 people were killed in this attack, but this was precipitated by the deaths of 5 million Allies in trying to defeat an enemy that started the war. So something here a little bit later in chapter 9, it's like really perfect illustration of Vonnegut's good fortune, bad fortune. um, idea is that this section where it's after the bombing, and Billy and the other soldiers are going around in a group, and basically collecting supplies and gathering things. And Billy's in the wagon, which is being pulled um, by horses, and the others are looking for souvenirs and other things. And it says here the Trofimodorians would advise Billy to concentrate on the happy moments of his life and to ignore the unhappy ones, to stare only at pretty things as eternity failed to go by. And that was something that I brought up. Some of you wrote about on the discussion board, which is, does Billy do this in the book? Does he follow this advice to focus on the happy and the good and ignore the bad? And it said, if this sort of selectivity had been possible for Billy, so that implies that it's not really something that he is able to do. He might have chosen as his happiest moment his sun-drenched snooze in the back of the wagon. So just this very peaceful moment in the aftermath of this horrible event, where he's identifying this as his happy moment, just this period of relaxation and maybe de-stressing. At the same time, though, as you're going to find out right after that, um, that an officer comes and points out to them how terrible the conditions are for the horses. And as it says here, basically when Billy, they made him get out of the wagon and look at the horses, and then he realized the suffering, the pain that they were in. Um, he burst into tears, and so this emotional upwelling. Right after the happy moment, you have this really sad, tragic moment, and it really just had this profound impact on him to see these poor creatures, and how they were, the condition they were in, and the pain that they were in, and how he and the others were oblivious to that. And so, just this idea of being oblivious to suffering, or the inhumanity of people, and how they can treat others, and treat animals and other living things, and how it's easy to lose sight of that. And this all that brings all that to the forefront, as well as this idea of the good and bad fortune. This moment that at one point is the happiest moment of his life, or one of the happiest moments of his life, to this point where in all the terrible things that happened in the war, this is the one thing that really brought him to tears and had this profound emotional impact on him. And right after that, he points out this idea that, yeah, he cried afterwards, later in life, never in a demonstrative way, but privately and quietly. Um, and then Vonnegut then inserts himself into the book here again to reference the epigraph, which is about the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. And so this idea of suffering in silence is one way of looking at that. Another way of looking at that is when it says he often saw things worth crying about, but he didn't, or he cried very little. Also, the other side of that is this idea of indifference, or hardening, ignoring things that are emotionally challenging or difficult, and not being willing or able to confront them because it's just too overwhelming or just too sad. I should also mention with the horses, the connection or the relationship between their condition and how they were treated or being treated by Billy and the others, versus how Billy and the soldiers, when they were forced to march with no shoes or terrible shoes, and their feet were all bloody and torn up. Uh, Really a direct connection there between those two things. And that's a really important point, that Billy is basically having just been victimized and mistreated by the German soldiers, is in effect, he and his friends are basically doing the same thing to these horses, and not even thinking about it, not even being aware of it. So that makes the important point of how this is, everything is sort of an endless loop, or endlessly repeated, and it doesn't leave a lot of hope for um, breaking out of human nature, uh, who has a tendency, or which has a tendency, to sort of impose itself on others and to cause harm, and not always be sensitive to the impact it may be having on life around it. And the chapter is going to end with a return to that serenity prayer in a visual form. And this is basically the source of where Billy um, got this from. So Billy, remember, has this prayer in his optometrist's office. I had mentioned that it's something that's associated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and that's where she had gotten it from. Montana Wildhack is the movie star that was kidnapped and held with Billy in the zoo in Trafalmador. But it was a locket that had a photograph of her alcoholic mother, and engraved was the Serenity Prayer. And so, um, again, a return to this very important point in the book with these various experiences of death, of um, confinement, various challenges and sufferings. That this is basically the lesson or a major message, a major point that Vonnegut wants to communicate. Now, chapter 10 kind of gets away from the story for a little bit and links it more to the current events. So, chapter 10, which is very short, which is going to end the book, Vonnegut brings it right into the present when he talks about the assassination of Robert Kennedy, which was 2 nights ago from the time this book was written. Or he was shot 2 nights ago. He died the night before. Martin Luther King was a month ago. So this is 1968, right? May of 1968 basically is where this is. And then he relates that to what's going on in Vietnam. And so he's bringing this book into the contemporary time. Again, almost like the trick of time travel. It's not so much about Billy Pilgrim now, but about the author Kurt Vonnegut and bringing the transformation of time and place. And because he's in Massachusetts, as he says, Robert Kennedy, whose summer home is 8 miles from the home I live in, he's mentioned that before about being on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. But also this idea of Vonnegut and the framing device I mentioned earlier from chapter 1, and this is the closing of the frame because he is now bringing the book full circle, and then bringing himself back into the story and intertwining that with the story of Billy. He also then mentions Kilgore Trout, so he's bringing all these things together really at the end of the book. But in chapter 10, again, with the framing device, going back to the closing of the frame, it's about Dresden and his trip back to Dresden with his war buddy. So this is now Vonnegut and not Billy, although the experience of being in Dresden was the same, or similar, I should say. One of the points that is made at the end of the book here between O'Hare and Vonnegut is this just statistical. There's a lot of numbers and statistics in the book, which ultimately have the effect of de-emphasizing the individual. And so, the idea is if we don't have free will, if there's so much in our lives that's determined by fate, and we're really just the playthings of these enormous forces, as Vonnegut says, we all want to think we're special, but ultimately, when you look at the numbers, we're not. And one of the ways he does this at the end is this statistic about how many babies are born a day, how many people are in the world, how many people die during the day. And so basically, this is 50 some years old at this point, but there's a net gain of about just under 200,000 people each day in the world. And Vonnegut says, yeah, I suppose they'll all want dignity. And, there's irony there because, yeah, they all will. Will they all get it is another question. But just the idea of the human scale or the scale of humanity and the individual, where the individual fits or places on that scale is ultimately microscopic. It's just a tiny, tiny piece. And this is every day, 190,000 a day. But the individual being just a tiny, tiny piece of this much larger puzzle. And then going right from that, you have these two contrasting images. One about the mass of bodies and that basically there were so many bodies they didn't even bring them up anymore out from underground, these caves, these air raid shelters, that they basically just cremated people right where they were. They just stood outside the shelters and burned the people um, in the shelters. And then you have so you have that image of this mass death, and then you have the contrast with the individual death. Um, and again, right after that statistic, it's sort of just making the point of this is death on a massive scale. And yeah, you don't want to lose sight of the individual within that. But then ultimately, the question becomes, what's the relevance or the significance of an individual within that much larger scene of mass death? And so Edgar Derby is that tragic figure who is caught with a teapot and arrested for plundering, tried and shot. And then there's the "so it goes" phrase repeating. And the final paragraph, the final section here, it's remember he's already said it's going to end with a bird singing, so we know that nature is going to have relevance here at the very end of the book. But he also brings in this idea of springtime, and which we think of rebirth, right? Because this happened in February, the bombing of Dresden, and so the war is ending in May. As he says here, the Second World War in Europe is over. I don't know if you guys have been following the news, but it was just the 75th anniversary of that last week. Um, and so this idea of endurance and what does endure within all the larger scheme of man and what destruction he can cause to the world around him and to others, that nature does endure, and that there is a permanence there. Spring will always come after the winter. There is always this opportunity for rebirth. So this is the idea of hope that you find within a lot of the pessimistic and tragic viewpoint of Vonnegut's writing. There's always that nugget of hope, that potential for hope. Um, so the war was over, right? That's great. Now, of course, there'll be, as we know, other terrible things and death and war to follow. And as the book's being written and published, it's at the height of Vietnam and social unrest in America. But there was, and so again, the image is that he ends with, at least in terms of the surroundings of Billy, is coffin, death. But then contrasting with this image of death, the coffin, the symbol of death, you have this image of hope and endurance and life through nature with the birds singing. And so the very last image of the sound of this bird singing um, is what Vonnegut wants to end with. So once again, there's this kernel of hope within all this death and destruction um, that is out there, that maybe our world is not too bleak, that you need to find the positive and seek that out and to celebrate that and to focus on that and to a certain extent um, ignore the bad things and focus on the good. So that does it for Slaughterhouse-Five. I hope you guys enjoyed it. A lot of great ideas in there, great story. Like I said, prepare for Monday for there to be a short-timed essay on no red ink during the time that your class would meet, and it will be based on the entire book. And I'll just do like last time, where I'll allow you to use the book um, as far as to incorporate, if you want to incorporate quotes or whatever into your essay. So if you have yet to do so, check my feedback from your first essay on Slaughterhouse-Five. I put on Veracross, the comments are on no red ink. Check that and see my feedback if you did not get full credit, and see what my comments were, and then you might want to take that in consideration for your next essay. But certainly the most important thing is, as it's spelled out on the essay prompt, that you are responding specifically to the prompt in terms of answering what is being asked, and that you are providing plenty of details from the book uh, that would serve as evidence, and then you are detailed and specific in connecting that evidence to your overall position. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me about that. I hope everyone's doing well. I've been thinking about you guys a lot. Definitely missing being at school and interacting with you guys, getting to see you. But really, right now we're winding down doing the final planning here, and I projected on Veracross yesterday what next week's going to look like, and then next weekend's Memorial Day weekend, and then we pretty much have not even quite 2 full weeks after that, which will mainly be focused on the 20 time, wrapping that up, and then you guys doing your presentations and your final products for that. So everyone have a great weekend. Supposed to be beautiful weather out, so make sure you go out and enjoy it. And I'll talk to you guys soon. Take care. Bye-bye.